is the second session of the conference for this year, and it is entitled Songs. And I am your chair for this particular session. My name is Hernan Tesler-Mabé. I am the president of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, and I want to welcome you all if you have not been with us for the last hour or so. And so we have this fascinating session devoted to songs, and there will be two speakers today, Miranda Crowdus and Mariana Dobrev-Holder. And what I will do is we will, just to review what Jesse said, I will introduce each of the speakers in turn. Each speaker will then have 20 minutes to share their paper, conference paper with us. And we'll go speaker questions for everybody at the end of that. So if you have any questions, please note them down or put them in the chat, and then we'll go from there. Miranda is the first speaker here. Miranda Crowdus is assistant professor at Concordia University, where she holds the research chair in Canadian Jewish Studies and directs the Institute for Canadian Jewish Studies. And Miranda will be presenting a paper entitled The Musical Tastes of Jewish Montrealers, Preferences and Practices During the Pandemic. Miranda, please.
Thank you so much, Hernan, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everyone for organizing such a vibrant, interesting conference. I'm just going to try to just share my PowerPoint. Yeah. Okay. Can everybody see? Okay. Fantastic. So I'm going to jump right in. This is not finalized research. In fact, the project was conceived in late 2021. And the component about which I'll speak today is just one part of it. The motivation, or the springboard, I guess you could say, for the project is that for the majority of people, music and sound are integral components of our lives, yet our everyday engagements with them are seldom studied or researched. Even outside academia, the soundtracks of our daily lives exist, but are generally unnoticed or a matter of course, perhaps physically heard, but cognitively and critically unremarked. My theoretical framing is very much reliant on Christopher Small's groundbreaking book, Musicking, The Means of Performing and Listening, which was published in 1998. I'll give you a description since I imagine most people here are not familiar with Small's work. Essentially, Small dismantled traditional studies of Western music and arguably non-Western music too, through the assertion that music is not a thing, but rather an activity. Musicking is a verb introduced by Small that encompasses all musical activity. So whether you're talking about performing, composing, listening to a playlist on a smartphone, while jogging, humming a tune while working, this all goes under that umbrella category, musicking. Small demonstrates how musicking forms a ritual through which all participants explore and reaffirm the constituents of their social identities. What I like in particular about this is kind of the sense that individuals and groups of people occupy these different musical or sound-based worlds, if you like, in which an array of music-related practices and rituals are embedded. So essentially, I'm looking, if you like, at the musicking or the musical worlds of Jewish Montrealers presently. I'm also very reliant on Sarah Cohen's, in my opinion, underrated work, specifically her article, Sounding Out the City, Music and the Sensuous Production of Place, in which Cohen actually looks at the city of Liverpool and Jewish musicians within it and how they construct their sense of place to the city. So I'm very, I'm beholden, I'm very thankful to these scholars in particular, but to many others as well. So yes, Montreal is the focus here. Beyond the practical purposes, the fact that I was raised in Montreal, my positionality, and the fact that I am here location-wise, there are other compelling reasons to make this kind of the point of investigation. Of course, the musical practices and preferences of Jewish Montrealers are aspects of Jewish life that have yet to really be studied in a broad sense to date. But also Montreal is home to an incredibly vibrant and diverse Jewish community, and it's highly important North American hub, a cosmopolitan capital for music practice, performance, and production in both Jewish and non-Jewish contexts as well, past and present. And these are way too numerous to itemize even the most important ones here. But I'll throw out the cantorial tradition, which has diminished, and now there's a revival. For example, in non-Jewish circuits, the International Jazz Festival. I mean, it's too kind of numerous to name here, but there are certainly compelling reasons to make that the point of study. Also, the placement of Jewish demographics, Jewish organizations, and the constellation of Jewish networks in terms of the urban geography is very particular, not to mention the linguistic diversity that informs everyday negotiations of identity and belonging. In other words, the Jewish community of Montreal itself as a geospatial environment forms a really important dynamic and interdisciplinary case study. So I missed my overview. There we go. So this is kind of how we're going to go in this presentation. So I'd like to locate this within, hopefully, summarize its location within the field of Canadian Jewish studies, how hopefully both complements, supports, and differentiates itself from previous scholarship, both in Canadian Jewish studies in general, and the few explorations of musical Jewish Montreal, if you like. So the project focuses on specificity of experience at different moments, or convergences of time, individuality, and urban space. The focus is on practices, trends, psychological, religious, and sociological conditions and intersections, many of which are specific to Jewish Montreal, I argue, without the necessity of connecting these to broad historic movements or events, although I do that quite often, so, but not always. Two, the urban framework of Montreal means that the project attempts to cover the gamut of the diversity of Jewish musical experiences across a wide range of modes. So it doesn't focus on the biography or musical production of a single person or of a clearly delineated group of people like cantors or the Hasidic community. People have done some wonderful research using those parameters. This is a little bit different, nor does it focus on kind of a music festival. Like I'm thinking of Jessica Rhoda's wonderful work on the Sephardic Music Festival. But all of those things do complement and support the project. It focuses on the everyday, the here and now, in the broadest kind of sense, the lived experiences and engagement with music of those who reside in Montreal and identify as Jewish in some way. Yeah, I guess the last point is quite important as well, is that the project aims to engage with the topic, not only in terms of academic research in its conventional sense, but the aim is to occupy a place kind of in the gray zone between research creation, creative production, and community outreach and engagement. So that's also a goal. Let's see. So some of the research questions that are being posed, there are a lot of them. So I'll just kind of focus on the umbrella. They all fall under these sort of thematic areas, if you like. However, they're not distinct. Some inform others. So I don't mean to suggest that these things are necessarily separate, but just for the ease of presentation, I've presented them this way. One of the main questions we're looking at right now, and I think it's because it's very fresh in people's mind, the pandemic and restrictions associated with it. It's still ongoing, albeit in a diminished form, and let's hope it stays this way. So, you know, what impact has the pandemic situation and related restrictions, both coming from above, as it were, and coming from personal choices? What has that had? Impact has that had on musical practices and preferences of Montreal Jews? One I'm very interested in is to what extent music listening in particular, but also practice, how can it act as a stress reliever for members of minority groups, particularly during the challenges posed by the pandemic? We are exploring the connections between Jewish identity, Montreal Jewish identity in particular, and the musical preferences of Jewish Montrealers. Second really important point of emphasis is highlighting the specific Jewish Canadian experience. What can we glean using these fieldwork methods, which I'll get into. Can we learn about this and in a relational sense? And how can these discussions open doors for future scholarship and programming in Canadian Jewish studies? Find this is a very important point. The third point I feel is refining ethnographic approaches. I recently took part in a wonderful workshop at the University of Syracuse called One of Us, ? Insider, Outsider Ethnographic Practices, which specifically geared or oriented toward Jewish communities, fieldwork in Jewish communities, and to what extent our roles as insiders and outsiders in these communities, to what extent it helped, to what extent it created challenges. And so the goal is to really move toward refining scholarship in this respect and sort of create I guess, a support system for optimizing ethnographic fieldwork that deals with Jewish communities. That's another, I think, a big topic. And also how can the data that we get, how can that stimulate creative processes, creative products, if you like, and performance, and so on. So it's quite wide ranging, I think, at the moment. And maybe if we look at some methodology, some methods, this will become more clear. As I say, it's an ongoing project. So the main data collection tool we're using at the moment is the survey, and this is its French form. Here I have the English form here, which I'll read a small excerpt from it. So it's very user-friendly. It's intended not to intimidate people with too much academic language, but to genuinely communicate that we're interested in hearing about people's experiences. So if you identify as Jewish and are 18 plus years of age, are living in or are from Montreal, we are interested in hearing from you about the music that you listen to or the music that you make. Music is all around us. Maybe it is the muzak playing at your local grocery store, or maybe music forms an integral component of a religious holiday. Maybe you have a favorite workout song or playlist that energizes you. Especially during these challenging times, the musical choices that we make might help us unwind, even during lockdown or quarantine. Music exists around us in diverse forms, from music that you hum while waiting for the bus, or the upbeat melodies that you might play while preparing for Shabbat or getting ready to go out. What music do you listen to on a regular basis? And so on. So in other words, we're trying to encourage people to respond in a kind of, trying to be as approachable as possible in as much as our outreach goals are concerned. Another approach is immersive ethnography, which is a more kind of holistic form of ethnography, which I find to be incredibly useful. I don't think during this presentation I have time to get into it here, but then we have also participation observation forms, and that's very, very useful, and it often involves playing music together. So that's another, we haven't yet reached those levels of engagement in terms of ethnographic fieldwork. And then focus groups, or people who've expressed interest in the survey, we can talk to them more about their musical experiences and so on, and their ideas moving forward. I should say that in the case of the survey, the idea is not just to use it as a kind of means of obtaining data in an extractivist sense. The first thing is to prompt participants to think about the connections between musicking and their Jewish identity. And two, in a case where there's often a divide between Jewish communities and the academy, I wouldn't say there's hostility necessarily or anything like that, but there is a kind of disjuncture. I don't know if it's the case as much in other Canadian cities, let's say in Toronto, or but there's definitely an idea, it's the university, it's Concordia, they're not really interested in what we do day to day. So the idea is going to, I guess, kind of dismantle that stereotype a little bit and say, hey, yes, we actually are very much interested in what you have to say. And the idea is that it helps form future programming at the Institute as well. So there's a whole ton of pragmatic and Institute-related concerns here. So that's, for the most part, the goal is a kind of qualitative analysis. So look at the diversity of responses and the different ways in which participants think that their musical consumption intersects or shapes their Jewish identity, or what they have to say. But there is a qualitative, hopefully, element as well, which we haven't been able to kind of explore because we don't have our responses complete, but that's definitely on the table as well. I wanted to also share with you some challenges in collecting data, in undertaking fieldwork. And the first, which might be fairly obvious to some people, is just that only the people who are generous enough to spend their time sharing their experiences with us will only hear from those people. So the survey, it's not exactly dense, but it's not something you can easily access on a smartphone and just click a few buttons. You actually have to critically reflect and think about your childhood and so on. So it is something that only those kind enough, and I will say a big thank you to those who have already responded. That's been immensely helpful. So I do think, on the other hand, as long as it's balanced with these other approaches, that the data is very useful. Another thing, analyzing the data. When you interview, let's say, a musician or a cantor about their musical practices, they're used to communicating at least something about music, about their process, because that's what they do for their job. When you interview or ask people questions about their everyday musical practices, they're not used to thinking about it. And sometimes they just don't know. Even professional musicians can't always easily articulate how they perform or what they get out of something. They just do it. So that's another, I guess, another challenge. I will say people are extremely articulate about describing how the pandemic has affected their lives. So at least there's kind of a balance there. And finally, negotiating insider and outsider ethnography. There has been some scholarship on Jewish Canada that considers the positionality of the researcher, or that has been self-reflexive in terms of a critical assessment of the Jewish community. That's something I definitely hope to continue here. My own insider and outsider positionalities have to be a site of critical reflection and negotiation in relation to this ongoing fieldwork. Just to get a quick example, my practice of Judaism, I'm observant, but it does not completely align with normative denominational divides. So this is a bit of a double-edged sword, because it means that you can have access to many denominations, many communities, but on the other hand, you can be, participants can regard you with a bit of mistrust because you associate with that shul, or so it's, again, it's a double-edged sword. But all that to say that I do see maintaining an awareness of the complexities and often porous inflections between insider, outsider Jewish identities in the fieldwork process is a tremendous site of productive tension and research potential. So, it's a silver lining, I think the expression is, to look at it as a site of positivity and potential, rather than merely a challenge. So I'd like to share some preliminary results, if you like, that I hope you find interesting. This doesn't account for everything that we've found, but just highlighting a few examples. Case one, the migration of music prayer, which I use as a kind of compound noun, from semi-private to public outdoor urban space. Negotiations of urban spatialities were necessary for Jewish prayer during the pandemic, owing to social distancing situations and closures. What is interesting here about the music and sound component is that even while the urban spaces, so alleys, terraces, gardens, allow Jewish prayer gatherings to be relatively contained, unnoticed, or unobtrusive for the most part, it is actually the music that defies and overwhelms these boundaries, bleeding over or sounding out into other spaces. Examples of those are Hasidim in Outremont, who form minyanim outside, Hutchison Street, Gerb, around those areas. There's also the Ruel Shul, so the alley shul that formed, which is a kind of, I would characterize, I could be wrong, it's alternative observance. They formed a regular minyan in an alleyway in NDG and are still going strong to my knowledge. So very, very interesting negotiations there. Another very interesting example that I'd like to share. In the previous examples, the pandemic prevented congregants from meeting inside a building, a synagogue or a community center, thus curtailing the ability to produce music, prayer. Indeed, singing was cited as a particular volatile transmitter of the COVID-19 virus. As such, the pandemic curtailed the musical practices associated with prayer. Jewish Montrealers requiring them to form new spaces for religious observance and sonic dissemination. However, in another example, it was precisely the restrictions imposed by the pandemic situation that opened up spaces for musical expression in a context where pre-pandemic social and religious norms effectively did not allow for music making. This was related to the Montreal neighborhoods and the Jewish populations who live in them. One participant explained that she was of modern Orthodox observance, but had moved to a more religious neighborhood so that her husband could go to his preferred synagogue. In so doing, she observed the mitzvah of welcoming guests into her home and was thus compelled not to sing Zmirot at her own Shabbat dinner table for fear of offending her guests. Her son, observing that she no longer sang, also decided to remain silent during dinner. As a result, their tradition of singing Zmirot at the Shabbat table was discontinued long-term. It was only when the pandemic prevented them from receiving guests that their family Shabbat singing practices were revived. So it's kind of a very interesting example that has to do with also with Jewish neighborhoods in Montreal and how some of them are accessible and walkable and some of them are not. And there's no Eruv, let's say, around them. So that was a very interesting one for me. Another big one was music making, actually listening as well as a stress reliever. And I'm going to be a little bit bold, I think, and share some of these kind of creative processes through which we explore musical aesthetics a little bit. So I was very taken by some of the examples that some participants shared of musical numbered songs, actually, that allowed them to sort of unwind and reduce stress. We sort of looked for congruences, patterns, both sort of musical aesthetic in terms of the sound, but also in terms of the tensions between them. So I was working on it. It's unfinished kind of sonic exploration, but I hope you can hear it. See, please, how many different textures and sounds you can get out of it. Just gonna see if it will play. I don't think it. Okay. So you get the idea. It's kind of a sound collage that we're working on to, in terms of musical analysis, to find some sonic convergences. We use different types of software to do that. So it's a more technical or creative side, and that's unfinished, an unfinished piece, but certainly interesting, and also has its own challenges to do with getting copyright and permissions, to use the sounds in some ways, which can be I'm used to dealing with it at this point, but it's nevertheless a surmountable challenge when working with this material.
Sorry to interrupt, Miranda. We're just a little bit over time, so if you can wrap up soonish.
Thank you for the heads up. I will actually write out my concluding remarks, so it's perfect timing. I would say thank you, first of all, for letting me share this project. Is very much in progress. I would welcome any feedback, and I think even at this early stage, you know, these few results do reveal that Jewish Montrealers, their musical experience and musicking very much do have to do with everyday negotiations of Jewish identity in urban space. And if we examine practices during the pandemic, these really highlight the intersections between musicking and the construction of private and public space and the sounding practices within them, the neighborhoods where there are high concentration of Jewish communities and the different levels of religious observance in them, and also music as a tool for stress relief during the pandemic. And I'll just show you a last quick slide, which again is a work in progress, but this could be, so you see the color codes correspond to the different types of musicking. So, you know, mapping Jewish Montreal, the music of Jewish Montreal, this is something that moving forward would strive to do a sort of interactive map as part of maybe community outreach practices. So again, very much straddling those kind of, or overlapping those boundaries between research, creative practice, and community engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miranda. That's so fascinating. I myself have way more questions that I'm going to be able to, that I will have time to pose. So hopefully we'll have a lively discussion about that. And in that pursuit of that, let me move on to our second speaker, Mariana Dobrev-Holder, who is at the University of Ottawa.
Toronto.
Oh, sorry.
Toronto.
That was a total Freudian slip. I'm at the University of Ottawa. I'm so used to saying that out loud. Mariana is at the University of Toronto. Let's see if I can get that right. Sorry about that. Holds a PhD from the University of Toronto in religion and diasporic studies. Hopefully I'm getting that right now. And teaches in the areas of mythology, including ancient Near Eastern mythologies and the Bible, folklore, and sacred space. And her talk today is entitled Songs of the Plague, and I will pass it over to Mariana from the University of Toronto. Sorry about that.
Thank you. First, I really want to thank you for this wonderful combination, listening to Miranda, who is taking the pulse of the moment. My presentation is looking way back. So it is pretty good combination between both of us, I think. And my presentation brings back several Yiddish songs forgotten under the dust of time, okay, century of time. Let me move to share the screen. Okay. So I'm trying this here. Okay, just yeah. Oh, okay. So for us 21st century consumers of music, the songs have been reduced to entertainment. However, in earlier times, the healing powers of music were employed at critical events, personal and social. The Renaissance treats a sound as a medicine to temper bodily humors and to solicit divine help. In addition to the pleasure that their melodies provoke, folkloric and all urban songs are records, lessons, warnings, and sometimes guidance. Many compositions survive 14th century that responded to the bubonic plague. The medieval composer Guillaume du Mouchard withdrew to his hometown far from the trade routes and continued to compose, lamenting for the loss of his bohemian life left aside behind. Camus is right. We were surprised. We all were surprised and were waiting for our plague to be away in 2 weeks. Now, my presentation takes a closer look at urban and folklore, rural folklore songs depicting the plague, flu, and different epidemics. We will start with 3 urban Yiddish songs from the early 20th century, created in New York around the time of the Spanish flu. One is Menschenfresser, Kinder-Magäfe, and The Orphans. They are stories of devastation and an emotional representation of a historical period that was forgotten. 2 years ago, when this song, Menschenfresser, became popular, again after 100 years, its tune and words unexpectedly resonated and connected with people. So here, let me see whether I'll be able to okay, I'm not going to waste time. I think the video was inserted, but we can't hear this. This song is revived by Sveta Kundish and Daniel Kahn. Here's the text of the first song mentioned, Fresser, written in 1916. Initially, Solomon Smulevich wrote the ballad to express the collective devastation of the war. Outbreaks of tuberculosis, cholera, and polio. But sometimes the art has the ability to catch a glimpse of the future. When Spanish flu started in 1918, this song instantly became popular and gave an emotional name to the flu, a human eater, the devourer. Now, in this song, we can notice several interesting elements. One is the tendency for literal description and almost scientific vocabulary, the bacilli, the microbes, but the medical terms are personified and visualized. They build their nest, they gobble us up and our body and soul. By personification of the plague, people face a real enemy, not a distant geographical location or invisible microbe. The image is intensified by comparison with a monster and a fire, a blazing fire which makes the human mind powerless and silences the wisdom. Written in times of war. The song, the last verse especially, is an open political accusation. When people die in millions, the rulers, the kings play chess. So this is a picture from 1918, pandemic and a war. Menschenfresser uncannily points to our contemporary piling of calamities, but in a reverse order. In 2022, it is flu and war instead of a war and flu in the distant 1918. The next two songs, Kindermagäfe, Children's Plague, and The Orphans, shift the focus from the general picture to the personal tragedies. The song Kindermagäfe describes the medical disaster of polio epidemic that touched many families and children. Fathers and mothers are crying now. Terror reigns in every home. We have one poignant picture of dark, uncertain years: war, polio, flu, tuberculosis, and The Orphans is a song telling the story of a recent immigrant family, a mother who dies from flu, and a father taken to a hospital with tuberculosis, asking the question, who will take two orphans who have been left without a home? The narrator in this song hears noise on the street and asks what happened. They answer me that two little children are dead from hunger and cold. So I came across these significant songs while looking for folk songs, particularly for folk songs. However, it was only in the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th when Joel Engel took interest in Jewish folk music and started systematically collecting songs, vocal and instrumental. The usual description of folk is an authentic creation by a group handed down orally. Sirosi, however, argues that if orally transmitted music as a symbolic construction of the group historical self, then all Jewish music, aside of the liturgical, is folk music. Instead of focusing on stylistic features, Sirosi considers that the Jewish folk music is rather defined by context of performance outside of the liturgy, gender, women, men, the language of the songs, Jewish vernaculars, and use of musical instruments. If we follow this conceptualization, the three songs bear the folklore spirit. But it's not only the folklore spirit we could find in these songs that align them with folklore. The melodic modal structure is another feature. Natural minor is a characteristic of most of the Jewish folk songs. According to Beregovsky, more than 50% of the melodies are in natural minor. Here is an example of natural minor, this natural major and minor. Circle here is the minor. Jewish songs are influenced by German and Eastern Slavic folk music, both using predominantly natural minor scales with various variations of the Phrygian and Dorian modes. Even Hava Nagila, Let Us Rejoice and Be Happy, uses minor mode, but in a more exotic Spanish variant. With this lower second. The clearest feature of major is usually the distance, this interval, which is CE, is a major third. Yes, here is major third, but we have this lower second. To me, those three first notes represent the life as mix of higher and lower episodes of joy and sadness, similar to the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, the first four notes, the knock of the destiny. So to me, this is the Jewish knock of the destiny here. The study of Levi and Zumwalt, ritual medical lore of Sephardic women, is conducted in several countries in the Balkan area, where the heirs of the 15th century Spanish Jews live. Along with the healing practices, these researchers have gathered curious information of influence of the local traditions on the Jewish life and music, including coffee reading, which is still popular on the Balkans. Next is, now we will look at the rural folk songs. The next songs are from the Balkan Peninsula, collected in Bulgarian villages in the 19th century by Mariana. This is the beginning of a 5 pages long dramatic song, uniquely descriptive. I'm sorry, my cat wants to participate also. Almost Shakespearean heartbreaking drama with unexpected end. Let me see here. I will summarize this dark drama. The plague knocks on the door. I'm sorry. She's very social. She always participates in my Zoom meetings. The plague knocks on the door of the wealthy and good-hearted Duke, who has 9 sons, 9 daughters-in-law, and 9 grandsons. But she cannot enter the yard, which is guarded by 9 ferocious dogs. She tricks Duco by turning into Black Bear, and he lets his 9 dogs out, leaving the house unprotected. Then she turns into a poor woman. He opens the door to give her food. And when he opens the door, she laughs and jumps on his right shoulder. Duco understands that the plague has won, but he asks for only a 3-day delay to gather the village and his family for a farewell meal. The plague agrees, and he prepares bountiful meal of 9 rams, 9 lambs, and 9 cows, barrels of wine and brandy. For 3 days, they eat and drink. On the last day, he says, here I am, I'm ready. Here are the last, let me see how to do. Here are the final lines. It turns out that the slaughtered animals were his daughters, sons, and grandsons. The plague did not take Duco's life. It left him alone. A devastating end of loneliness and a different type of death. The two characters, Duco and the plague, are clearly depicted. The first is handsome, wealthy, generous, treasuring his large family. The plague is often skeleton of a very old, scary woman, long, scurfy hair, long hands, long nails, and black hooded gown. Deviously friendly, the plague assumes various guises and shades, but can be assuaded by negotiations. According to some folkloric tales, if honored, she will pass by the house to mollify her people, clean up the house and leave hot water, soap, and comb at night, since the plague can come and rest in their house. And of course, after them, she can hopefully leave. While the above songs depict the family tragedies, the next one warns about the demographic changes. Folk wisdom anticipates the costly demographic results of epidemics and urges young people to marry sooner rather than later. When many lives are lost, finding a mate is of crucial importance. Curiously, COVID-19 has had a similar devastating consequences on the dating landscape for singles. We are not isolated in villages. We are technically connected, but not face in face. Just a moment now.
Sorry, Mariana, we're at around 20 minutes, so it may be 2 or 3 more minutes, if that's okay.
Okay, so here, not long ago, the folk songs and tales were a way to transmit accumulating knowledge. And here, main suggestions can be boiled down to run in the woods always. So we experience this. Many city people follow this advice. To conclude, I will briefly offer some comparison. Okay. Both rural folklore and urban songs elaborate the dire demographic consequences of the disease and a record of calamities. However, the two types of songs differ by their content. The urban songs, Men's Eater, Kinder, Magafe, and The Orphans, serves to involve pathos. In contrast, rural folk songs embody knowledge that prescribes practical advice for prevention. The Spanish flu and COVID are mindless, invisible microbes without ethics that are not amenable to negotiations. But when the plague is robbed of its persona, the human imagination is wrought of strategizing. Thus, humans are left as victims. Yet the intense personification delivers a different approach, offers something to negotiate with. The mythologizing attributes a mind and personality, and defensive strategies becomes intuitive. A human-like enemy empowers people to resist and devise surviving tactics. So I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Mariana. It's so interesting. Yeah, this is excellent. So I'm gonna, we have about 10 minutes left for questions. So I will, if anybody has any questions, I would love to hear them.
Yeah.
And if not, I shall proceed with my own. Be warned. Would anybody like to ask a question?
Hernan, this is Jonathan. Yeah, I have a question
for
Miranda. Now, given that the that music sort of pivoted from a lot of live in-person types of performances to the virtual environment, especially, I guess, during the first, 18 months of the pandemic. And I know that I was listening to an awful lot of Jewish music in particular during those first 18 months online, coming from mostly the US, but also from Quebec and the rest of Canada. Given that the accessibility to perhaps unexpected and previously untapped musical venues online was, in your opinion, was this a good thing for Jewish music, particularly coming out of the Montreal area, or did it did performance that was going on here sort of get swallowed up in the whole virtual universe of Jewish music?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. That's a really good question. I don't think I can completely do justice to it here because it's huge, but that definitely makes some comments. The first thing is, what I did notice is that certain, let's say, like music as stress relief, certain anxieties or certain uses of music as a tool that were present before became accentuated in various ways. So that was the first thing that I found surprising, actually, because I thought, oh, these music is going to be used in these new ways, but actually it wasn't. It just kind of was transmogrified or transformed, the access and so on. So yeah, that's one thing. I can't really comment on to what degree, music production was improved because it curtailed, it inhibited the live music in so many ways. So I would say largely that definitely had a detrimental effect on especially live music performance. Pre-existing networks had to put everything on hold. So the listening component was definitely heightened, I would say, and in more almost in a more introspective way. And I mean, the example of the religious Jewish woman, I think, is quite interesting because, in fact, the private space allowed her to express herself for vocal singing. So that's interesting. I guess the last comment is that when you look at this transnational access through playlists, through and so on, and this is the past 20 years, it's really required the development of new theoretical frameworks, methodologies. So I think some ethnomusicologists have looked at the playlist as a kind of metaphoric, a sort of metonymic expression of identity and so on. Now, I feel like the connection between listening to music and identity, it has been oversimplified. I think often in ethnomusicology, you'll get, this is the music that people are listening to. This is the music that they are making. This is a complex manifestation or expression of their identity. And I think that's highly problematic. So I do try to look at it in a slightly maybe more nuanced way, hence this kind of this negotiation of space and of spatialities within the urban space. So hope that answered the question a little bit.
Thank you.
I would like to, sorry,
yeah,
I would like to add something which this question reminded me. In our synagogue, we started gathering regularly every week and sometimes singing songs. So before the Friday Shabbat Lachem, we would do singing. Then we arranged guitar lessons, piano lessons, and I actually didn't pay much attention to this, but it was the first instance when we gathered a few friends and we were singing songs. So very, very kind of moving experience for this.
Interesting. Any other questions? What else? I don't know if I'm looking at the screen there. I'll throw mine out right away. Mariana, where did you find the songs for the Spanish flu? What repository? Where was it? What archive did you find that stuff in?
I started with the looking at the folklore books, collections of folklore books in the 20th century, but I found them on internet. I came across those 3 songs. First was the Men's Thresher, and I find those 3 songs fascinating because they're like picture of the time, picture that been absolutely forgotten, and now it so much resonates with our emotions that we had during these times. I think in my there is a edition from 1916 of songs, Jewish songs. It is between 16th and 20th. So they're in this edition, but also on the internet, they're available.
If I can link that, unless somebody has another question here, I would kind of like to link that to Miranda's work. Miranda, do you anticipate that there will be similar music created, similar Jewish music created for this pandemic? And if not, why not? And if so, what? Well, yes.
Good question.
That's a really good question. And I'm certain there will be music, whether it's going to directly interface with the themes of the pandemic in a way that's discernible, or whether it's that people were simply stuck at home during lockdown. I know my partner is a composer and has been composing music as a result of being, now whether that's directly pandemic related or discernible in the music, so to speak, I don't necessarily think so. I can definitely speak to listening practices, even from the little information that we've gathered, so Jewish listening practices certainly have changed a bit, especially in young people who feel generally oppressed by what they cite as being sort of cancel culture and perceived government control, who then listen to sort of both Jewish and non-Jewish rap music. I don't know if you're familiar with Tom McDonald and Little Dicky, who, if you want some controversial Jewish rap, listen to his Jewish groove. But this, again, and I think this overlaps with stress release. So people's musical tastes, especially among young people, I think, who experienced a lot of stress, our students at the university experienced a lot of stress, they kind of reached out to music that I guess would permit kind of catharsis or release of energy. So I see that on all fronts, on a spectrum of where it's very observable that the pandemic was the kind of springboard and more indirect, I guess. Does that answer the question?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, it does. I see we're at 2:45. If anybody would like to pose a final question, obviously we'll make time for that. But if not, we'll unfortunately have to wrap this session up. I'll just give a moment for that. I don't see any other questions, and before I tempt myself into asking another question, I will try to be responsible and close the session on time. So this was, thank you to both of our speakers, Miranda and Mariana. Sorry for speaking incorrectly about affiliations.
I know.
Early on, Mariana. I was delighted with both papers, and I truly hope to be in dialogue with both of you in the very near future about this. So we now have a 15-minute break, and we will reconvene here, and from 3 to 4:30 p.m. we will have our third session on anti-Semitism and Holocaust commemoration, and we look forward to seeing you all back in 15 minutes. And until then, schmooze or go get some water. See you soon.